The history of the Middle Ages is often painted in the vibrant colors of heraldry and the glimmer of polished steel armor. It was an era defined by the rise of majestic cathedrals and the shifting borders of powerful kingdoms. Yet beneath this veneer of chivalry lay a reality of profound filth and struggle. Civilization is built upon the backs of those who perform the necessary but invisible labor of society. In the medieval world, this labor often required a descent into the foulest aspects of human existence. The infrastructure of a growing city, or the textile industry of a nation, relied entirely on men and women willing to endure the unendurable. These were not merely jobs, but life sentences served in the shadows of the castle walls. To understand the true nature of this historical epoch, one must look away from the throne room and into the gutters. Here begins the descent into the olfactory and physical depths of the medieval workforce. Number 5 brings us to the thriving wool trade of England and Flanders. Wool was the economic engine of the era and created vast fortunes for merchants and nobility alike. However, the process of turning raw fleece into fine cloth required a chemical agent that was readily available and free. This agent was stale human urine, which contains high concentrations of ammonium salts, perfect for cleansing grease from fibers. The worker responsible for this task was known as the fuller or the walker. Their days were spent standing knee-deep in vats of collected urine, stomping on the cloth for hours on end. It was a rhythm of endless drudgery that permeated the skin and clothing of the worker with an inescapable stench. The fuller was a vital cog in the medieval economy, yet he was marked by the very tools of his trade. Even in a time when hygiene was different from today, the fuller remained distinct due to the chemical aura that surrounded him. The physical toll of marching in acidic liquid caused skin conditions and joint ailments that plagued these workers until death. Yet without their labor, the fine tapestries and warm cloaks of the aristocracy would never have existed. It is a stark reminder of the human cost behind historical luxury. We move deeper into the realm of biological hazards with number 4. Medieval medicine was dominated by the theory of the 4 humors, which stated that illness was caused by an imbalance in bodily fluids. The most common treatment for a vast array of ailments was bloodletting performed by barber surgeons. To facilitate this delicate procedure, the medical profession required a steady supply of river leeches. This demand created the profession of the leech collector. These were often impoverished women who waded bare-legged into cold marshes and stagnant ponds to offer themselves as bait. They would stand still in the murky water, waiting for the parasites to latch onto their skin. Once the leeches were attached, the collector would peel them off and store them in a vessel. It was a job that required the worker to sacrifice their own blood and health for a few copper coins. The constant loss of blood led to dizziness and severe anemia among the collectors. Furthermore, the open wounds on their legs made them susceptible to dangerous infections lurking in the swamp water. It was a slow and exhausting form of self-destruction, driven by the desperate need for survival. As the population of Europe expanded in the High Middle Ages, the density of cities like London and Paris created a crisis of sanitation. This leads us to number 3, the Gong farmer. Stone castles and timbered houses were equipped with latrines that emptied into deep cesspits or cellars. These pits were not self-cleaning, and eventually they would fill to capacity, threatening the structural integrity of the building and the health of its inhabitants. The Gong farmer was the man tasked with the removal of this waste. By law and custom, they were only permitted to work under the cover of darkness. They would descend into the claustrophobic pits with buckets and shovels to manually excavate tons of human waste. The air in these confined spaces was thick with methane and hydrogen sulfide. A single spark from a lantern could cause an explosion, while the fumes alone were enough to suffocate a man. The waste, known euphemistically as night soil, had to be carted out of the city limits before sunrise. Despite the absolute necessity of their work, Gong farmers were social pariahs, forced to live in designated areas away from the general populace. They were the invisible custodians of a city's health, yet they were treated with disdain. The psychological burden of working in silence and darkness surrounded by filth cannot be overstated. They were well paid compared to other laborers, but the coin came with a heavy stigma. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that such work was performed night after night for centuries. Number 2 reveals a profession that dealt with death on an industrial scale. In a society dependent on horses for transport and oxen for agriculture, the death of large animals was a frequent occurrence. The carcass of a horse is heavy and rapidly decomposing, and it could not simply be left in the street. Enter the knacker. While the butcher dealt with animals fit for human consumption, the knacker handled the diseased, the old, and the inedible. They were responsible for dragging the carcasses to the rendering yards, usually located downstream or downwind from the settlement. There, the knacker would strip the animal of its hide for leather and boil the bones to create glue. The smell of the rendering vats was reportedly so overpowering that it could be detected from miles away. It was a sensory assault that clung to the land and the people who worked it. The knacker was often considered an untouchable figure in medieval society. Like the executioner, he was necessary but feared and avoided by decent folk. His home was often isolated, and his family was excluded from the communal life of the village or town. The work was physically grueling and carried the constant risk of contracting anthrax or other zoonotic diseases. To dismantle a rotting draft horse with primitive tools requires a constitution of iron. It forces us to acknowledge the brutal logistics of a pre-industrial world where nothing was wasted and everything came at a price. Finally, we arrive at number 1, which represents a descent into the macabre that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. While the previous jobs dealt with waste or animal remains, this role required direct contact with the most terrifying tragedy of the era. The mid-14th century brought the Black Death, a plague that wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. The sheer volume of death overwhelmed the traditional rituals of burial and mourning. The churchyards were full, and the fear of contagion paralyzed the community. In this apocalyptic landscape emerged the plague corpse bearer. These men were often survivors who were believed to be immune or desperate souls with nothing left to lose. Their duty was to enter the infected houses marked with a red cross to retrieve the dead. They carried the bodies of men, women, and children onto carts and transported them to mass plague pits. The risk of infection was absolute, and the emotional toll was shattering. They witnessed the collapse of families and the complete disintegration of social order. The corpse bearer walked through silent streets, where the only sound was the creaking of the cart wheels. They were surrounded by the sensory reality of the plague, the swollen buboes, and the blackened skin of the victims. It was a job that stripped away the sanctity of death and replaced it with a grim efficiency. History records that many of these men drank heavily to numb the horror of their daily existence. This was not merely a disgusting job, it was a confrontation with the fragility of human life. The plague bearer stood at the threshold of the end of the world, performing a duty that no one else would touch. It is the ultimate example of labor born from catastrophe. These 5 professions serve as a window into the lived reality of our ancestors. We look back at the Middle Ages and see the stone fortresses that have survived the centuries, but the mortar of history is mixed with the sweat and struggle of the fuller, the leech collector, the gong farmer, the knacker, and the corpse bearer. They remind us that civilization is a fragile construct maintained by those willing to do the work that others turn away from. Their stories are not recorded in the illuminated manuscripts of kings. Yet their silent endurance is what allowed the medieval world to function amidst the chaos. History is often written by the victors, but it is built by the laborers. In the stench of the fuller's vat and the darkness of the cesspit, we find the undeniable truth of human perseverance. It is a legacy deserving of both our horror and our respect.